On the morning of February 6, 2019, a private plane was scheduled to take off from West Virginia, headed for a bank in Lynchburg, Virginia. On board was supposed to be a 38-year-old father of two named Michael Cochran. He believed he was finally about to see the money from government contracts his wife had told him about for years, money that would prove the business was real. That flight never happened. His wife canceled it that morning. By that afternoon, Michael was lying unconscious on his kitchen floor. By February 11th, he was dead. It would take federal agents, a Ponzi scheme worth $2.5 million, an exhumed body, and a forensic pathologist willing to call it murder to finally answer the question that haunted his family for 6 years. What really happened to Michael Cochran? This is not just a murder case. This is the story of a man who spent 19 years building a life with a woman who was, underneath everything, lying to him the entire time. And by the end of this video, you will understand exactly how far she was willing to go to keep that lie alive. Unreal True Crime launches its new book, Unreal True Crime, Latin edition. 35 shocking true murder cases from across Latin America. Buy it now on Amazon. Michael Brandon Cochran was born on December 23, 1980, in Beckley, West Virginia, to Michael Edward Cochran and Donna Bolt. He grew up in Raleigh County, in the heart of Appalachia, the kind of region where everybody seems to know everybody and reputation matters as much as money. Raised primarily as an only child, his stepfather Ed Bolt entered his life when Michael was around 8, and the two formed a bond that would last the rest of Michael's life. From boyhood, Michael was defined by physical activity. He played baseball, basketball, and football, got his first set of weights around age 10 or 11, and by high school had won first place in a powerlifting competition. Fitness and sport were part of his identity from childhood, a detail that will matter later, because it becomes a central argument in his own murder trial. When Michael was around 17, he met a girl named Natalie Jessup, reportedly at a sporting goods store where she worked. Both eventually enrolled at West Virginia University. Michael in information technology, Natalie in pharmacy. In November of 1999, during their first semester, they got engaged. They married in May of 2000. After the wedding, Michael and Natalie settled in Daniels, West Virginia, and began building the kind of life that looks, from the outside, completely ordinary and good. Michael worked in information technology, doing work connected to cable and coaxial systems. Natalie became a licensed pharmacist, a profession that carried real weight in their community, giving her instant credibility everywhere she went. The couple had 2 children, a daughter named Nicole and a son named Ashton. But if you ask the people who actually knew Michael, the truest part of his identity was not his job. It was fatherhood and youth sports. Michael coached football and baseball, and he was the kind of man other parents wanted on the sidelines, present and invested, not just for his own children but for other kids too. One family friend described how, after a young boy in their community lost his father, Michael stepped in, taking him fishing and bringing him to practices, giving that child a steady male presence he no longer had at home. That is the Michael Cochran who existed before any of this began. A husband, a father, a coach. For 17 years, this was simply Michael's life. Nothing suggested tragedy was coming. That began to change in 2017. In 2017, Michael and Natalie became connected to a new company, Tactical Solutions Group, often referred to as TSG. On paper, and especially on its own website, TSG presented itself as a serious government contracting business, claiming to be a supplier to the United States Department of Defense. A second company, Technology Management Solutions, operated alongside it. Natalie quit her job as a pharmacist to run the business full-time, becoming majority owner while Michael held a minority stake. To the family and the wider community, it looked like an exciting new chapter. Natalie, the trusted local pharmacist, stepping into government contracting and entrepreneurship. What nobody knew yet was that, according to investigators, Tactical Solutions Group had never actually been awarded a single federal or state government contract. Technology Management Solutions had secured 2 state contracts, but West Virginia ended up canceling both due to repeated delays. The grand image of a defense supplying company was built on almost nothing. But Natalie did not present it that way. She told friends and family the business model was inspired by the movie War Dogs, a story about young entrepreneurs who made fortunes navigating loopholes in military contracting. To people who had known Natalie and Michael for years and trusted them completely, it sounded like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. So they invested. Natalie persuaded at least 11 people to put a combined total of approximately $2.5 million into the business. To make the promises look credible, prosecutors later said, she allegedly used stolen identifying information belonging to people connected to government and banking institutions, sending investors emails that appeared to come from those legitimate sources. This was not just verbal deception, it was an entire false paper trail. The lifestyle that followed made the lie even more convincing. The Cochrans eventually owned 3 homes, bought motorcycles and an antique 1965 Shelby Cobra, and took vacations to Paris and Hawaii. On one loan application for $100,000, Natalie and Michael reportedly claimed business assets exceeding $500 million. Before the larger fraud became public, there was an earlier warning sign few people connected at the time. Natalie had served as treasurer for a youth baseball league account, and members began to suspect money was missing after a fundraiser. A private investigator named James Quisenberry found purchases at places like TJ Maxx and Olive Garden, made with funds meant for the kids program. Natalie was never criminally charged over the baseball league money, but the suspicion planted a seed. And there is one detail that matters enormously for understanding Michael's role in everything that follows. According to former investigators, Michael Cochran did not know the business was a fraud. He participated in looking for contracts to bid on. But that, according to one investigator's testimony, was about the extent of his involvement. The same false information Natalie was feeding to investors, she was also feeding to her own husband. By 2018 and into early 2019, cracks were forming. Investors who had handed over their life savings or retirement funds wanted to know where their returns were. And so did Michael. Text messages later examined by investigators showed Michael beginning to realize there were things about the business he did not understand, particularly the gap between how much money investors said they had put in and what Natalie had actually told him. He was not asking these questions as an outsider. He was asking them as a husband and business partner who believed completely that the company was real and that the money existed somewhere. He simply could not understand why it kept being delayed. Natalie's solution, according to the prosecution's later theory, was to schedule a trip. Michael and Natalie were supposedly going to fly to Lynchburg, Virginia, to meet with bank executives and finally access funds connected to the supposed government contracts. A pilot was booked. Michael, according to a close friend named Christopher Davis, who later testified about it, was genuinely excited. He believed this was the day he would finally get answers, finally see proof, finally understand that the business his wife had built really was as successful as she always said. The flight was scheduled for the morning of February 6, 2019. That same morning, Natalie texted the pilot and canceled it. On the same day that flight to Lynchburg was supposed to happen, something else was unfolding inside the Cochran home, something that would take years to fully understand. A neighbor named Jennifer Davis later testified that Natalie had complained she was feeling ill and needed insulin. Davis packed insulin into a bag and had her husband drop it off at the Cochran house that morning on his way to work. Natalie reportedly told Davis she needed it for herself. At 12:21 in the afternoon, Natalie texted a contractor named Jason Bowen and asked him to come to the house because Michael was sick. When Bowen arrived, he found Michael lying on the kitchen floor. Natalie asked him to help move Michael to the couch. Bowen would later testify that Michael did not respond when people spoke to him, and that even a sternum rub, a hard knuckle pressed into the chest, meant to wake an unconscious person through pain, produced no reaction. After the insulin had been dropped off, Natalie reportedly sent Jennifer Davis a photograph of Michael unconscious on the kitchen floor. Davis described the image as shocking. More people began arriving at the house. Stephanie Hamilton, a physician assistant and close family friend, came and found Michael completely unresponsive. She told Natalie that he needed to be checked by a medical professional and offered to go with her to get him help immediately. According to Hamilton's later testimony, Natalie's response was that Michael needed to sleep it off. Christopher Davis, the same friend who had spoken with Michael about the Lynchburg trip, also came to the house. He found Michael on the couch, not talking, not responding to anything around him. Davis insisted that Michael be taken to the hospital. Hours hadn't passed since Michael first collapsed. Multiple people had seen him unconscious. Multiple people had urged that he receive emergency medical care immediately. And yet, it was not until later that day that Michael finally arrived at the hospital. When he did, his blood glucose level was 21. To put that number in context, a blood sugar level that low is not just dangerous. It is close to fatal on its own. A physician assistant who saw the case later explained it plainly. Nobody should have a blood sugar level of 21. A person at that level is typically in a coma, fighting for their life. By the time doctors examined Michael, the damage had already begun. He had developed cerebral edema, severe swelling of the brain caused by the prolonged, catastrophic drop in his blood sugar. He never regained consciousness. Michael was transferred into hospice care. There would be no recovery. The swelling in his brain was too severe. The window for intervention long since closed by the time anyone had gotten him real medical help. On February 11, 2019, Michael Brandon Cochran died. He was 38 years old. At the time, his death looked, to almost everyone outside the immediate investigation, like a sudden and devastating medical tragedy. A relatively healthy man, a husband, a father, a coach, had inexplicably suffered a catastrophic drop in blood sugar and died. There was grief. There was an obituary that spoke of a man who loved life and loved coaching youth sports. In lieu of flowers, the family asked for donations to Shady Spring Middle School baseball, a final tribute to the role youth sports had played in Michael's entire life. Nobody, at that point, was calling it murder. In the months after Michael's death, the financial side of the investigation that had quietly been building around Natalie's business continued to develop. Investors who had never received their promised returns kept pushing for answers, and eventually their complaints reached federal authorities. In June of 2019, police executed a search warrant on the Cochran home connected specifically to the financial fraud investigation. While searching the house, they found insulin. At the time, that discovery did not immediately reopen Michael's cause of death, but it was logged, it was documented, and it would not be forgotten. In September of 2019, Natalie was formally indicted on federal charges connected to wire fraud, bankruptcy fraud, and money laundering. The investigation revealed the true scale of what she had built, a scheme that ran from approximately June 2017 through at least August of 2019, persuading at least 11 people to invest roughly $2.5 million into contracts that, according to federal prosecutors, were either grossly exaggerated or did not exist at all. A retired West Virginia state trooper named Timothy Bledsoe later testified to something especially disturbing. Natalie had continued looking for new investors to fund the fake military contracting business even after Michael had died. The scheme had not stopped with her husband's death. It had kept going. In 2020, Natalie pleaded guilty to wire fraud and money laundering. As part of the plea agreement, she agreed to pay nearly $2.6 million in restitution and to forfeit assets that included 2 pieces of real estate: the 1965 Shelby Cobra, multiple other vehicles, jewelry, and roughly $45,000 from a business account. In March of 2021, she was sentenced to 135 months in federal prison, more than 11 years, and ordered to pay over $2.5 million in restitution. For the public, this looked like the end of the story. A pharmacist turned fraudster, caught, convicted, sentenced. But investigators had not stopped looking at the insulin found in that house 2 years earlier. And in November of 2021, while Natalie was already serving her federal sentence for fraud, she was indicted on a new and far more serious charge: first-degree murder for the death of her husband, Michael Cochran. The murder case moved slowly through the legal system, delayed by exhumation procedures, additional forensic testing, and pre-trial motions. Michael's body had to be exhumed 7 months after his original burial so that a new autopsy could be performed. Medical examiner Dr. Piotr Kubicek conducted that exhumation autopsy and testified that he could not determine a clear cause of death. Decomposition over those 7 months had made it impossible to identify potential injection sites or confirm insulin use directly from the tissue. That inconclusive result became one of the strongest tools in the defense's arsenal once the case finally reached trial in January of 2025 in Raleigh County Circuit Court. Prosecutors Tom Truman and Ashley Accord built their case around a central argument. Natalie killed Michael because he was getting too close to discovering the Ponzi scheme, and the canceled Lynchburg flight was the breaking point. If Michael had gone to that bank and found no money waiting for him, the entire fraud and Natalie's freedom would have collapsed. The medical testimony at trial became the battlefield. Endocrinologist Dr. Diane Krieger testified that the brain swelling had already begun by the time Michael reached the hospital, and that insulin was, in her professional opinion, the only explanation that made medical sense. Forensic pathologist Dr. Paul Uribe went even further, testifying that Michael's blood glucose level of 21 was, in his words, profound, and concluding that Michael had been administered insulin and that his death was a homicide. Uribe acknowledged there was no direct physical evidence of insulin found in Michael's body, since the exhumation autopsy happened years after death, but he maintained that there was simply no other reasonable medical explanation for such a severe and persistent hypoglycemic state in an otherwise healthy, non-diabetic man. FBI forensic examiner Earl Gleam testified about an insulin vial recovered from the Cochran home, stating that the rubber top appeared to have been punctured. Another FBI chemist confirmed that 2 of 3 liquid bottles recovered from the house matched their labels, insulin and a steroid, while a third did not match what it claimed to contain. Investigators also revealed that Natalie had given conflicting accounts of what happened that day. In one version, she said she and Michael were sitting together when he walked into the kitchen, fell, and hit his head on the counter. In another version given the very next day, she said Michael had been asleep on the couch, later walked into the kitchen and collapsed there. And she also claimed Michael had been injecting himself with insulin in his back. Prosecutors pointed to these shifting stories as evidence of consciousness of guilt. The defense, led by attorneys Matthew Victor and Stanley Selden, did not deny the financial crimes. Their argument was that Natalie was, in their words, perhaps dishonest in her financial dealings, but that dishonesty did not make her a murderer. They leaned heavily into Michael's relationship with fitness and supplements. Natalie's own daughter, Nicole, testified that her father was obsessed with his physique and took enormous quantities of supplements daily, describing pills laid out on the counter in a circle the size of a dinner plate. Both children testified about alleged steroid use, including claims of oral steroids obtained from Mexico and anabolic steroid injections. The defense argument was straightforward. Maybe Michael's death came from supplement use or an underlying health issue that had nothing to do with Natalie at all. The jury did not find that argument convincing. On January 29, 2025, the jury found Natalie Cochran guilty of first-degree murder. They had deliberated for less than 2 hours, a remarkably short window that both prosecutors and Michael's family interpreted as a sign of just how compelling the state's case had been. The next phase determined whether Natalie would have any possibility of parole. In West Virginia, a first-degree murder conviction allows the jury to grant mercy, opening the door to eventual parole eligibility, or deny mercy, resulting in life without any possibility of release. The mercy phase split the family in 2 directions. Natalie's mother, Daphne Jessup, pleaded with the jury, telling them that Natalie's children needed their mother and that she and her husband Larry might not live long enough to see Natalie again if mercy was denied. Natalie's daughter, Nicole, called her mother her best friend and said she wanted her present for future milestones like birthdays and the births of her own children someday. Natalie's son also asked the jury for mercy, reminding them that their decision would shape the rest of the children's lives, not just Natalie's. The jury began deliberating the mercy decision at 3:53 in the afternoon. They returned at 5:18 with their answer, no mercy. Natalie Cochran was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her attorneys later filed motions seeking acquittal or a new trial, arguing the case should have been moved to a different venue and that certain evidence should never have been admitted. Judge H.L. Kirkpatrick denied those motions, finding that the jury had acted fairly throughout. Michael Cochran spent 19 years trusting the person closest to him, right up until the day that trust cost him everything. If this case affected you the way it affected us, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one.